There are three basic approaches to doing a budget. There are variations on a theme for all of these, but these are the primary categories that you can consider when you're doing a business budget. Category number one, top down. This is often also called strategic budgeting. It usually comes from a 5-year strategic plan, a 3-year business plan as the starting point. So you've got large goals that are influencing the preparation of the budget. And what I mean by that is that a strategic plan, say a 3-year business plan, often has revenue targets, cost of goods sold, if you have that type of business, and operating expenses, as well as some certain assumptions about profit margins, the amount of growth that you would expect to see over that same period. Starting with those key elements, then the budget is built off of those, and more detail is added as you go down the line items in the budget. For example, in a top down budget, starting with a 3-year business plan, you may know that the revenue for year one is $5 million and that the expected profit margin is going to be 25%. You may also have some information about the types of expenses that are expected to be incurred during that time frame, usually again in large buckets: salaries, advertising, facilities costs, cost of products if you do have that type of business. But beyond that, there's not a lot of information. So the budgeting process is going to take those key assumptions and it's going to spread them out over the various months in the year, and then it's also going to build onto the expense detail. So if you have facilities costs, how much of that is going to be rent versus utilities versus maintenance? If you have salaries, how much of those are going to be related to each type of department, and so on down to the income statement. That was option number one. Option number two is actually the complete opposite, which is a bottoms up budget. You may also hear this referred to as zero-based budgeting. And what that means is that you're starting at the lowest level of detail, assuming everything has $0 in it, and you're building it up as you go. So in our prior example, where we talked about facilities, knowing that we had $500,000 worth of facilities costs, and then we layered that into how much was rent, utilities, and maintenance. In the bottoms up approach, what you would do is you would say, here's my lease agreement for my facility, and that's my rent every month. And then there would be some assumption about utilities and maintenance costs associated with that. A bottoms up budget doesn't often start with a target at the beginning. It starts with usually historical information as the best influencer in terms of building up the costs. Other things that come into a bottoms up budget include any agreements that have already been signed, like a lease agreement as an example, any customer contracts that may already be in place, any employment agreements that you may have, any vendor agreements, particularly if there are minimum purchase requirements. All of those things would influence a zero-based budget. And then the third option, you may have guessed, is some sort of a hybrid approach. Now, you'll often see a hybrid approach as something that looks like a much larger company budget where departments are given targets for their departmental budget. And so there's more detail around what the budget is going to be. Specifically, the reason it's not a full top-down budget is because the budget has already been delineated into departmental budgets, and those departments often have very specific purposes. And then accordingly, the department then does a bottoms-up budget. Now, one of the ways that a hybrid approach works really, really well is that oftentimes there are company level objectives that have already been set. Now, those may not be based on a 3-year business plan or a 5-year strategic plan, but they are what's needed to meet some of the baselines that the company already has in place. Some of those have to do with debt payments. that is a very, very common one, that there are covenants in place by banks or other lenders that the company has to meet. And therefore, they need to achieve a certain amount of volume and they have a certain cost structure in order to generate the results that are required under those obligations. So those are some of the other considerations that would come into play and will often result in a hybrid approach because there are parameters or guidelines that the budget has to stay within and the company performance has to stay within. So you'll see those influence the budgeting process. The other thing that often happens in a hybrid approach is that companies with a great deal of fixed costs. So those could be facilities costs, this could be payroll costs, anything that's truly not 100% variable, often have those costs already baked into their processes, and there's not a lot of wiggle room. I mean, you could certainly exit your lease, you could certainly get rid of your staff, but those come with a lot of decisions and really high level discussions around making big moves in a business like that. And to the extent that you already have a customer base or you have these obligations to lenders, and all of those different factors, you're probably not going to dramatically change the nature of the business such that all of those things are fairly well known and can be just put as placeholders in the budget without a lot of work. So one of the things that I would really ask you to consider is what is the best type of budget for your business, the businesses that you're working with, your clients' approaches. There is certainly a consideration for what a company's mode of operating is when you're doing a budget. There are companies that will just not ever do a bottoms up budget. It's too much for them to consider. It's not something that they're interested in doing. They're not going to see the value in it, and they're certainly not going to prioritize or devote their time to it. That often happens when you have a company that hasn't done a budget before or has had a really bad experience with a budgeting process, either because it was painful and it took too long, or because it really didn't tell them anything about the business and they just don't see the value in it. So leave a comment. Let me know what you learned from this video, and please subscribe to our channel.